It's my pleasure today to welcome our first speaker, Mareena Robinson Snowden. She is a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mareena Robinson Snowden researches nuclear arms control verification, non-proliferation, and modernization. And before joining Carnegie, she served as a National Nuclear Security Administration Graduate Fellow in the Office of Major Modernization Programs. She is also an alumna of the DOE NNSA SSGF, same year as myself, and completed her practicum at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in 2013. And my favorite fact about Mareena is that in 2017, she became the first Black woman to earn a PhD in nuclear engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she holds a BS in physics from Florida A&M University. So, Mareena?
Thank you so much, and good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm gonna just grab my tea real quick. So I hope this can be very informal. As was said, my name is Mareena Robinson Snowden. It's so good to be back because this is home for me, right? I was an SSGF fellow from 2012 to 2016. And I am very excited to talk to you all today about some of my experiences post-graduate school, kind of where my head was at when I was coming up on graduation and how I navigated the last few years. So thank you to Chris and to the whole Krell and SSGF organization for inviting me to participate in today's events. So I want to talk about what I call beyond convention, right? So when people ask me, oh, what are you doing? I say, I'm on an unconventional postdoc right now, right? So we think about the first 2 years out of graduate school, the time of exploration, and I've really taken that literally, and I'll walk you through some of my thoughts and experiences since the defense. So a bit about me. As was said in the introduction, I was an SSGF fellow from 2012 to 2016, and I got my bachelor's of science in physics from Florida A&M University, which is a historically Black college in North Florida, in Tallahassee. I went on straight from there to Boston, very cold Boston, to the MIT Nuclear Engineering Department, where I pursued my PhD in nuclear security, basically. So my focus was on arms control agreements, and I was interested in radiation detection and monitoring. And the question that I looked at was, how do you use radiation detectors to verify arms control agreements? So we see a lot of this in the news right now, right, between the Iran deal, what's happening with the nuclear negotiations with North Korea. All of these different agreements have a verification component. We also see conversations with the US and Russia. Again, verification is relevant there, and we'll talk a bit about it in the next slide. So this is me when I graduated as a baby from Florida A&M with my BS in physics. This is my incoming SSGF class. I see Sam here. So all of us as babies, this was one of our poster presentations, and we did all the essay competitions and poster presentations and learned a lot while we were in the program. And this is in 2017 when I finally defended my PhD after 6 long years. So, as I said, a bit about my research. I was interested in nuclear arms control. And when we say arms control, we're thinking about agreements that help to restrain what we call the arms race, right? So this tit-for-tat competition between weapon states in terms of the number of nuclear weapons that they have. And the United States and Russia have been involved in this type of collaborative and cooperative participation since really the beginning of the Cold War, since the 1950s and 60s. And for me as a nuclear engineer, I saw my role as a technical person really in the verification space. So how do you help policymakers and decision makers in the security apparatus verify that their treaty partner is indeed complying to the terms of this agreement? So you think about one agreement that we're under right now is the New START agreement with the Russians that limit our strategic arsenals on both sides. So the number of deployed nuclear weapons on both sides are only allowed to be 1,550 on both sides. And we do a number of different inspections and surveillance procedures in order to verify that we are indeed doing that. That's one example. My research was really interested in this question of nuclear warhead monitoring. So if you've heard of the non-proliferation treaty, which all of us have likely heard of in this room, there's three main tenets of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty first, obviously, is about non-proliferation, right? Stopping the spread of nuclear weapons worldwide. So all of the participating countries to the NPT have agreed that they will not help to propagate the expertise, the equipment, the technology that would help a country either evolve their peaceful program into a military one or stand up a military program in and of itself, right? After non-proliferation, we have the idea of peaceful use, right? This is the second tenet of the NPT, which is every country has the right to use nuclear energy to produce energy for their populations, right? So we have a lot of developing countries that are interested in deploying a peaceful nuclear energy economy to meet their energy needs, and the NPT codifies that right for them. And the last tenet is disarmament. And this is really for the weapon states, right? So when we signed this agreement in 1970, there were 5 weapon states. There was the US, there was Russia, France, China, and the UK. And the third tenet of the NPT basically said, okay, you weapon states, your job in this agreement is to disarm eventually. We said in good faith. There was no timetable on that. Strategically, there was no timetable. And for me, when you think about disarmament, there's a bunch of different parts of the nuclear arsenal that you can think about. You think about the delivery systems, right? So the missiles, the bombers, the submarines. But there's also the weapon itself, the bomb itself, like, right, the nuclear weapon or nuclear warhead. And all of the agreements that we've participated in with the Russians on this track to disarmament have all focused on the delivery vehicles. We have yet to take apart in a bilateral fashion a nuclear weapon in a verifiable way. And this was really where my thesis research came in. How do you move the ball down the field on verification from just focusing on the delivery vehicles to now focusing on the warheads themselves? And I was interested in how could you passively detect a warhead that's in a box that the Russians present as this thing that's, under the treaty. So I looked at radiation interactions between 2 key materials in this open source, very crude model of a nuclear weapon, right? A basketball within a basketball. The radiation interactions between the weapons-grade plutonium and the high explosive, and looked at high-energy gamma emissions. And I did simulations and experiments, and at the end of it, now they call me doctor. So you get called doctor, and then you're in the world. And as I said, I think there is a common narrative about what you can do with a technical PhD. So we all know that you can go to the national labs, you can go to academia, right? And you can become a professor, or you can become a research staff scientist. For those of us who aren't sure that that's the path that we wanted to take, what do? And for me, I wasn't sure. I wasn't convinced. Coming out of academia, I think I might have had a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder from academia. So I wasn't really feeling that vibe. So I knew that wasn't the next step. The national labs were cool, but what we don't often talk about is the fact that when you leave your graduate program, like, life starts to happen. And there's other constraints on your time that kind of set your course. So I would have loved to have gone to Livermore or Los Alamos, but I also had a husband who started a company in DC. So he had given so much to me while I was in graduate school supporting my career in Boston. So it was time for me to support his career, hence we moved to DC. So you have to make a decision. How do you set up your life in a place where maybe you weren't expecting to be? And for me, the most important part of the postdoc experience is this last little piece, right? The purpose is acquiring professional skills to pursue a career path of his or her own choosing. So not that the PhD prescribes you to academia or to the national lab, but you can choose what your path will be. And after a little bit of soul searching, I realized I was always interested in the way nuclear weapons policy is made. And when you think about the ecosystems of nuclear weapons policy, who are the contributing players to what that end policy looks like? The obvious players are government, right? National labs, maybe some international bodies like the UN or the IAEA. But there's a very broad spectrum of folks that help to shape what that final policy will look like. Some of them are in the NGO space, right, in think tanks. Some of them are activist organizations that help to generate political will for one outcome or another, right? Some of them are the funders for the research, whether they're in government or they're private funders. So for me, I said, okay, what I'm going to do with my postdoc time, is try to interact with as many of these players as possible, understand the culture in which they do their work, how do they think about their contribution to the generation of nuclear weapons policy, and what are the currencies that they use in terms of measuring the value of their work, really trying to understand who these folks are. And I picked two sectors. So the first was government, and the next was the NGO space. And I'll talk a bit about my experiences in those two different environments, coming from academia, which was very different. So my first stop was the National Nuclear Security Administration, who funds this wonderful event and our graduate work. Thanks for that. It's a program called the NNSA Graduate Fellowship Programs, or NGFP for short. And it's an awesome program in that it brings you to the NNSA complex for 1 year. It's open to both technical and policy people, so people with international relations backgrounds, political science, nuclear engineering, astrophysics. You can be done with your PhD or in progress. You can be a master's student while you do the work. But they basically put you into, it's like a practicum. So you get put into the NNSA ecosystem, whether it's at a field office or a plant or headquarters, and you work there for a year. So we're all pretty familiar with the NNSA, but just a brief review if you're not. The NNSA is divided into three main buckets, right? You have what's called defense programs, or the program that's related to the nuclear weapons stockpile. NA-10 is the number. Then you have NA-20, which is basically the non-proliferation branch of the NNSA. That's where a lot of the international work goes on with trying to convert HEU to LEU for international systems, things like that. And then the big dog in the room, which is naval reactors, right? So the NNSA also produces fuel and different technologies and equipment in support of the submarine missions and the naval operations that go on there. So this is the cohort that I came in with. Where's Waldo? That's me in the back right there. And like I said, this was a group of 50-50. So 50% of us were technical and 50% of us were policy. And we basically got scattered across the United States. So as we all know, there's a bunch of different sites across the United States that constitute the weapons complex, or the NNSA complex, right? Some of them are design agencies. So when we say design agencies, we're thinking about the Livermores, we're thinking about the Los Alamos, the Sandias, right? The organizations that actually design these weapon systems. They have the production agencies, which are the Kansas Cities, the Y-12s, the Pantex, right? So once a weapon design has been produced, it's given to the production agencies to start building the different components for the weapon system. So Kansas City produces a lot of the non-nuclear components that go into these warheads, so the plastics and things like that, foams. Y-12 is responsible for all of the uranium production that happens, so whether we're talking about things in the secondary of the weapon or the primary of the weapon. Pantex is our primary assembly and disassembly facility, right? So whether you're retiring an old system or fielding a new system, like is currently happening with the Trump nuclear posture review that came out, it called for a new system to be developed. All of that assembly would happen at Pantex. And then Savannah River is responsible for the majority of all of our tritium production for the stockpile. So the NGFP fellows get stationed all over the United States. I was stationed in headquarters here in DC. And as I said, some of the perks to the fellowship, it's 1 year duration with no employment obligation on the back end, right? So you literally can try on this jacket, see if you like it, and if you don't, you can take it off, okay? So you come there, you get infused into the culture. They very quickly throw responsibility at you. One of the things I didn't appreciate as an academic was how the structure of government affects the work pace when you're in government, right? So I didn't know before I went there the term federal full-time hire, right? So there's this debate that goes on about big government or small government, right? We've all heard about this. And they have set a limit on the amount of federal full-time hires that certain agencies or all agencies across the government can make. And it's not dependent on the workload, right? So regardless of how much work you need to get done, you only have 1,200 federal full-time hires that you can make. So that means that as your workload increases, everyone's portfolio gets bigger and more busy. So essentially you're short-staffed. So the minute that there's new hands in the government in headquarters, they're throwing stuff on your desk. I need you to go to this meeting, I need you to go there, I need you to look into this from your first or third week. which is really exciting, but also a bit overwhelming, right? Because you don't actually know very much. So it's on you to ask questions, make sure you're checking in with your supervisor so that you're actually able to appropriately speak to the task at hand. As I said, another perk is exposure to the overall weapons complex. So in addition to you being stationed in a particular location, I was in DC, they have a lot of training and touring opportunities that you can take as a fellow that are open to both you and the federal full-time hires, right? So you're able to take all of the weapons design courses. You get a security clearance as a part of this program. So you'll get a Q clearance, which allows you to take all of the weapons design training courses, the history of nuclear weapons testing. So I was able to take a 2-week course where I went out to the Nevada test site. The first week was lectures on the test site, talking about the history of testing. We went through all the different tests, the craters. The next week, we rented 4-wheel drive off-roading Jeeps, and we drove around the test site, all off the road, into the different craters and talked about what tests were done there, what we were trying to do. We got to go down into an underground testing facility and see everything. That's stuff that you can't see as an academic or someone outside of the complex. And this is a great opportunity if you're looking for something short in that vein. And also, last but not least, is the potential pathway to the federal government. So one of the jokes you'll hear is how terrible it is to apply to the government through USA Jobs, right? The normal thing is they have a job listing, you apply, but God forbid you upload a PDF resume instead of a Word doc resume. No one will ever see your application. There's all kind of nuances there. If you want to avoid that, you can be an NGFP fellow, right? You can go there. This is a wonderful pipeline where I think about 50% of the NGFP fellows get hired on for those very tight federal full-time positions. So the office that I was in was called NA19, the Office of Major Modernization Programs. And this office is responsible for all of what we call the life extension programs for the weapon systems in the arsenal. So whenever, every year, the full arsenal is evaluated to see that it's reliable, that it's safe, right? And if there's ever any issue that comes up, whether it's an aging issue or something's going on with different materials, they'll go through what we call a life extension program. And there are currently 4 that are going on, 1 that's wrapping up. So the W76-1 has been going on for at least the last 10 years and is in its final stages of life extension. But you have the B61-12. So the B61 is a bomber system. It's a weapon that goes onto a bomber. The W88 is a warhead that goes onto a submarine. And then the W80 is a warhead that will go onto a cruise missile or an air-launched cruise missile. And these are the 3 that were under our office's portfolio. But in addition to the life extension programs, NA19 also has a second bucket called strategic materials. And strategic materials is basically all the materials that you need to go into these different weapon systems. So the 2 that we're most familiar with, obviously, are uranium and plutonium, because those are the fuel for the weapon. But there are some other ones that are of importance. If you want to have a boosted weapon, you need tritium. You also need lithium to go into different components of the weapon. And this kind of random, what we call domestic uranium enrichment program, which Sam's laughing, because it's not exactly a material so much as a capability, right? So it's a bit in the weeds, but we'll go there. So we need this domestic uranium enrichment program because there's a requirement that in order to produce the tritium that you need to go into the nuclear weapons, so we all know how tritium is produced, right? You have a thermal neutron that gets captured on a lithium-6, and then you produce a tritium on the back end, right? And I think alpha particle. So you're going to put a lithium-6, what they call a TP bar, so some lithium-6 inside of a reactor, expose it to those neutrons, and generate this plutonium. The uranium that's used in that reactor that's going to eventually produce this tritium, it can't just be any old uranium, right? There's this requirement that uranium either has a military use or a peaceful use, right? So we stopped enriching uranium for military use in, I think, about 1964. And we've been using reserves since then. But in all the evaluations that we've done, there's going to be a time when we run out of these reserves, so that we're not going to be able to just pull uranium from kind of the inventory and put it into these reactors. So what we need to do is we need to stand up a domestic uranium enrichment capability such that we can provide those reactors that will produce the tritium with what's called unencumbered and unobligated fuel. So that's where that comes from. So some of the lessons I've learned as an NGFP fellow. So the first thing is government experience and knowledge is very appealing on the job market. So if you want to stay in the government, like I said, it's a great pathway to get there. But if you're thinking about how do you move in this space and leverage your different experiences, everyone, whether we're talking about NGOs, whether we're talking about private sector in Silicon Valley, a lot of different organizations want to understand how the government thinks, how the government works, right? So if you've spent time and you understand the role of Congress, how Congress works with these different agencies, the budget process, how the politics work, who are the key players, right? You build a network in government. All of these things are things that you can leverage on the job market, right? The third thing, or the second thing, as I said, at headquarters, your portfolio is very broad and very fast-paced. So I think as an outsider, we tend to criticize government, saying that it's slow, the processes take forever. But when you're in government, it's anything but slow. Okay? I remember the first surprise was, in academia, I say, Raspberry, let's get together. We'll have a meeting. What's your calendar look like in like 2 weeks? Okay, cool. I'll put a meeting on there for 2 weeks. No, in the government, it's like, Sam. Okay, I need to meet with you. I'll be there in your office in 5 minutes. And that's the meeting, right? So you're expected to be able to shift your mind, that cognitive ability, cognitive agility, right? Be able to shift your mind from one subject matter to another and engage substantively very fast. It's not slow like academia on the inside. And there's a different currency in government, right? So in academia, it's about the quality of your ideas, right? You can be at a lecture and there's a Nobel laureate presenting their research, and if there's a data point that you're curious about, in science, what do? You raise your hand and you ask. I don't care if you're a Nobel laureate. I want to know why that looks like that. And that's celebrated in our culture, right? That curiosity, that challenge, that critique. In government, it's not like that. Okay, so if General Klotz is giving or Lisa Gordon Haggerty, who's the administrator of the NNSA, is giving a lecture at an all-hands meeting, and she has a plot that looks questionable, that is not the time for you to raise your hand and say, excuse me, Ms. Haggerty, I want to know about that plot, right? Like there's a level of discretion and a level of just knowing when the right time and the right place for that is, right? And some people don't understand that when they first get in from a technical background. Also, it's very hierarchical, right? So I was having this conversation earlier at breakfast about, would I ever go back? I think PhDs are very attractive to the NNSA, right? There's a certain level of prestige to a PhD, but I wasn't convinced when I got there that they really knew how to use my skill set, right? You get a lot of training as a PhD. You spend a lot of time learning how to be an independent thinker and independent researcher. And essentially what I was doing was program implementation, right? So we had set a program of record is what it's called, what we're going to do for the year. And as a federal program manager, my job was to implement. It wasn't to ask questions. It wasn't to wonder why. It was just to get it done, right? And it's important work, but for me, as I said, it wasn't the reason why I got the PhD. And it might come as a shock to no one, but the government is pretty political, right? And that was also interesting. So this idea of promotion, right? There is definitely an inside game at headquarters to promotion. So it's about, the quality of your work, but it's also very much about who you know. And there's a lot of backdoor dealing, people trying to poach really good candidates from other groups, right? So it's very house of cards in some sense. And you get used to it after a while. It was different for me when I first got there. And last but not least, the federal program managers hold a lot of power over the work that's done. And the reason why they hold a lot of power is because they delegate the money. And this is something I didn't understand when I got to government, was the role of Congress. We've all heard the power of the purse, right? That thing is real, okay? So every year, they go through a budget process. And each program asks Congress, this is the work that we need to get done. This is how much money we need to do that work. Then Congress takes that document and they debate it. And they say, I don't really agree with that. Do you need $55 million? What about 53? So they start going back and forth, and that's called a markup, right? So the House Armed Services Committee will mark up your document. The Senate Armed Services Committee will mark up your document. And then you hope and pray that it comes somewhere around that 100% mark, but it's not guaranteed. So in the event that you get all the money that you want, we're good, we're cooking, we're doing what we plan to do. in the event that the Congress only allocates or authorizes a fraction of the money that you asked for, now you have to prioritize, right? So certain programs might not get all the money that they need to execute the project, the experiments, right? You want to run a certain number of shots on NIF or this and that, right? That's coming from headquarters, which is coming from Congress. So having a relationship with these federal program managers and having federal program managers that understand and can advocate for your research in headquarters is crucial because that affects exactly the amount of work that you can get done in any given year. I had no appreciation for that going in. Now I have a firmer appreciation coming out. So that was my government year. Tried on the jacket. It was nice. Maybe I'll go back to it later, but I decided to go to a different shop. So my next stop was in the NGO space, so the non-governmental organization space. And this is basically the think tanks that help to influence government policy. And to do that, I did a program called the Stanton Nuclear Security Fellowship. So the Stanton Fellowship was, it's been around at least for the last 10 to 15 years. There's been some very prestigious thinkers and academics that have come through the program. But it was established by the Stanton Foundation to give young scholars the opportunity to pursue what they call policy-relevant research at some of the leading think tanks and academic institutions in the United States. So it's a valid question to ask what distinguishes research from policy-relevant research, right? Because we all do research here. So policy-relevant research, as I understand it or have learned, is basically research that's targeted towards the government based on their needs in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. So whereas in academia, you can ask a question just for the sake of the question, because it's for the science, for the culture. Nobody really cares right now, but it's interesting to you, right? Policy-relevant research needs to be interesting, needs to be relevant to your end customer, which is government, right? So that's why your time scale is so much shorter, because government isn't thinking 50 and 100 years down the line. They're thinking like, I have this budget for 5, 10 years, or the Russians are doing this now, how do I respond? All of this determines policy-relevant research. So the Stanton Foundation has identified about 7 different organizations that they consider to be the leading think tanks and academic institutions. So you have the opportunity to do a Stanton up in Cambridge at MIT, either in the Security Studies program, which is a more policy international relations program, or the nuclear engineering program, so you could have a more technical Stanton experience. Harvard Belford Center has a Stanton. I'm currently at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but there's also one at the RAND Corporation and the Council on Foreign Relations, Stanford, and the newest member is Texas A&M in their nuclear engineering department. So again, another option to have more of a technical focus on your Stanton experience. So as I said, I'm at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and what's important to say is not all think tanks are created equal, okay? So some think tanks are more research focused, which is like Carnegie. Carnegie prides itself in in-depth analysis that's targeted towards the government, but they spend a lot of time on their analysis and critique. Some think tanks are more advocacy focused, right? So they have an angle, they have an objective that they're trying to get accomplished with government, and that is what they lobby for. So my institution is more research focused, and as I said, the role of the think tank is to help government think about these problems, whether they're current or emerging. And we talked about the constraints of government, right? We're already short-staffed. My portfolio is already hella busy. I don't have time to think about 10 years down the line, what is Russia gonna do with their hypersonics, right? In government, this is where the think tank world comes in. Think tanks do have time to think about these problems that the government isn't currently addressing, whether it's in AI or hypersonics or additive manufacturing, right? How these things are going to affect the security dynamics in 10, 20 years. So we're producing content such that when there is political will or curiosity in the government, that work is already done, right? You can leverage that work because the NGO space has done it. So a lot of the work that we do here is research, but we're also taking those reports to government. So it was, funny for me, my first meeting as a Carnegie fellow was in the NNSA, going right back to my old shop to meet with people trying to ask for funding for research that we were trying to do based on some of the needs that they had, right? So there's a very symbiotic relationship between think tanks and government because there's this give and take, right? We want to help you meet your needs. So some of the current topics that I'm working on at Carnegie, I'm still in the verification space, but asking more policy questions now. So the first question I'm asking or working on is how do policymakers think through what's enough when they're designing a verification regime? So you think about, we're having this current negotiation with North Korea. Trump says, go big or go home, right? I want full denuclearization, and then I'll release you of these sanctions, right? Not gonna happen, but that's what he wants, right? Okay, so let's say they get a deal. There's gonna need to be a verification component to that. They wanna cover not just their nuclear program, but also their missile program. Not only their missile program, but also all their military R&D, right? All the high explosive testing, the initiator testing, all the things that go into either advancing or maintaining an arsenal, right? So when you're trying to design a verification regime, how do you pick what inspections need to happen? The frequency of inspections, right? There is a science to this. But what's the problem in the research, no one has talked about this process, and no one has talked about kind of how the final decision makers think about adequacy, right? Like, we've gotten enough confidence based on this design to say, yes, we'll sign this document. So that's one of my questions. And the next thing is directly related to that, which is, what should we do in this North Korean case? So assuming that we come out with an agreement, what should the verification of that rollback look like? And there's a lot of different programs that are addressing this, and we work kind of in tandem. So I have colleagues out in the UK that I'm working with, colleagues in China, colleagues in France that we're working on this collective project. And outside of the research, there's just been some interesting stuff I've been able to participate in. So Carnegie hosts a conference every 2 years called the International Nuclear Policy Conference, and it brings together 800 of the leading thinkers in nuclear security policy from government, from think tanks, from international organizations, and we just talk shop. So this is a photo of one of my favorite panels where Steve Biegun, who's the special envoy to North Korea for the nuclear negotiations, came. And the moderator, she's a reporter, I can't remember her name right now, but she was grilling him. Because what you will notice is government people are really good at like sliding out of a question. You know, you ask them a question and they answer what they want to answer. So she was not having it. So she asked him a question about this idea of going big or going home with North Korea, right? How likely is that? And he tried to pivot and slide, and she literally said, so we'll try this again. And she rephrased the question. And he made news at the conference. He said, this is where he said, because before he came to the conference, the idea was that the Trump administration would be open to what they call a phased approach with North Korea, right? I'll take progress here, that will lead me to progress on another thing, right? Before they started talking about going big or go home. This is where he said, no, we're going big or we're going home. And that was in all of the newspapers after the fact, right? And to be in the room and help plan the conference and see all of the background, be able to meet these government leaders, very exciting. And we also got to host our own side session panels on issues that we find of interest to the community, right? So we hosted a conversation around gender and ethnic diversity in nuclear security, right? The status of the field. What should the field be doing to be more inclusive and representative in terms of the full breadth of talent and skill that we have? And it was very well attended. We had an ambassador from the State Department and some other thinkers in the field that were able to talk to that. So, some perks of this fellowship. Like I said, 1 year for you to try on the jacket, see if you like it, no employment obligation on the background. It's also research focused. So when I was in the government, it was a stark difference from academia. There was no research involved. It was all program implementation. This was kind of a returning home, right? It felt very familiar. I'm reading a lot of papers. I'm citing work. I'm giving presentations. I'm making slide decks. It was a lot of the things that we did in our graduate work. And there's an opportunity to publish. So if you are thinking maybe 5 or 10 years down the line, you might want to go into academia, the publication record, for better or for worse, is important, right? So this is a program that'll let you do that. And as I said, you have an opportunity to engage broadly, not only with government, but also with media. This was a whole new thing for me. So in the think tank world, and I speak to this on the next slide, they present themselves as experts, right? And this is a very foreign label to me, right? Because in academia, you don't, like in the PhD, they beat you down so much, right? Like you're not an expert in anything, right? So you're giving your PhD defense and you're still concerned, like, do I actually know this stuff? Like, what are they gonna ask me, right? But in the think tank world, oh no, everyone, I'm an expert on hypersonics and this, that, and the next thing, right? So because you present yourself in this way, the media, whether it's newspapers, podcasts, print journalism, they're looking for people who can help them demystify a lot of these current events, right? So there's, the Iranians destroyed these tankers. What does this mean for the, JCPOA and all? They want people who can speak to that, so they reach out to you. So I've gotten calls from PBS, I've gotten calls from NPR that they want to talk shop about this, and you have to get comfortable and used to that, and there are people who can do media training to help you, so you don't have to be by yourself, yes. So I've been able to do some really interesting, I got to present in a panel on South by Southwest in Austin about the nuclear apocalypse. It was a really interesting discussion. I was far less dramatic than the title implies. I got to participate in some podcasts and also some interviews during the conference about different topics. And as I said, you get mentorship from leading security experts. So some lessons from the think tank space. As I said, even though they're independent from government, there is a relationship between think tanks and government that's a give and take, right? So they give us funding, we give them ideas, I'd help identify either current or emerging problems that are coming down the line for them. But as I said, the culture of the think tank depends on the institution. So if you're interested in being an activist, there are think tanks that do that work. If you're not interested in being an activist, which is my perspective, I'm interested in being a researcher, there are think tanks that do more of that work. But it's worth noting that the culture of the think tanks is very similar to academia also in terms of funding, right? So it is very much eat what you kill. So you have to go and raise your own money. You have to go, you're getting paid in kind of 2-year increments, right? Raising your salary, raising the funds you need to do the research. So there's a little bit less security in that. So if that makes you nervous, it's something to consider, right? And as I said, this expert label is something you get used to. I don't typically use it, but the best piece of advice that I got from one of my mentors at Carnegie was, you define what it means to be an expert. So there's some experts that are killing it on Twitter. They have 15,000 followers. They're tweeting every 5 minutes, right? I'm terrible at Twitter. I don't know how to use it, right? I'm not good at it. I'm a better writer, right? I'm also not good with like the shooting off the hip what I think. I need to think about it, right? Because you don't want to be irresponsible with your expertise, right? So you define how you relate to that word. So the last thing I'll leave you with is what I see as the benefits of taking this unconventional path, right? Of not going straight into a technical postdoc or one in academia. The first thing is that you challenge your assumptions about yourself, right? And what I mean is, the first thing is in your interests. So I remember leaving graduate school thinking, do I like research because I actually like it? Or do I like it because I've been doing it for the last 6 years, 10 years really, from undergrad, right? Is this just all I know? Or do I actually genuinely enjoy this? And I went into government and came back to research in the think tank space and realized, like, I actually like this. Like, I actually like digging in and knowing and learning, right? Because that's the purpose of research. You go from a place where you don't know the answer to where you know the answer. And that's a really exciting and frustrating process at the same time. But I wouldn't have known that I actually like it if I hadn't left and come back. And the second thing, which I think is the most important thing in this presentation, is you explore so you can convince yourself of your own value. And I say value, I mean monetary value, okay? So we have a skill set that is very relevant and very in demand and very marketable across a number of different sectors. So there's no need. We take an L in graduate school, right? In terms of, you pay your dues, you sacrifice, you're eating ramen noodles so you can get this PhD. But you don't have to eat ramen the rest of your life, okay? There is money in these streets to be made, okay? But you don't know that unless you go and talk to folks, okay? So I didn't know. A little small anecdote I'll share, just because I think it's relevant. I was on the job market recently, applying for positions. And, I'm thinking I've been out of the lab for 2 years. I'm trying to get back in the lab, so I'm only looking at technical positions. I'm thinking I've been out of the lab for 2 years. That's probably a mark on me. So they ask you on these applications, tell us your preferred salary range. So I was putting numbers that were like, postdoc level numbers, like, 100-something this, 100-something that. That's still more than we make now. We're making 36. What do we make? 36 here for the right? So 100. That sounds a lot, right? So I talked to my sister about it. She said, "Oh no, baby, that's not the right number." And I said, "Oh, okay." So she said, "Add 40 grand to that." So I said, "Okay." So she said, "You go in there in the negotiation and you just say, this is my range, right? My range is from this number to this number, $3,000 band." So I get into the interview with the hiring manager, and he asked me, "What's your preferred salary range?" I totally forgot that I wrote down this low number on the actual written application. So I said this new number, real confident, this new high number. And he's like, he said, that's interesting, because here you wrote down this number. I said, oh, that was an error. That was an error, right? Because it was an error. It was an error, and it was an error because I didn't understand my value. I didn't understand the market, and I didn't understand my value. So then, fast forward a couple weeks later, I got my offer, and it was the number I asked for, right? So don't leave tens of thousands of dollars on the table because you undervalue your worth. You need to talk to folks out here who know better than you. Thankfully, I talked to my sister who knew better than me. They could tell you to add a couple tens of grand onto that number because you have that degree, you have that skill set, you are worth this much. You gain an understanding of how different institutions work on a more intimate level, right? People make judgments all the time about what government is like and never spend a day in government, right? Have all these opinions about think tanks, never been in a think tank, right? I can talk about government because I was there. I can talk about think tanks, I can talk about academia, because I was there, right? So I think there's a certain level of credibility that comes with that. And the last two things, obviously you build your network across different sectors, which becomes valuable as you move through the space, and you gain clarity on your next professional steps. So with that, I will open the floor for questions. I talked about a lot of things, but feel free to ask me about any and everything. Thank you.